So, how much do you know about the differences between the 500 series gear and the standard rack mount gear? Hey guys, so if you're interested in audio gear like me, then you might have noticed the 500 series racks that can hold smaller 500 series versions of your favorite gear. But what are these and how are they different from the usually more expensive standard rack mount versions? Why do some people still spend more for the standard versions, and why do some people choose the 500 series instead? And what should you do? There's a good amount of debate out there on this one, and everyone seems to have an opinion, so I figured for today's video, I could share some of the info that I've collected about the differences and pros and cons of both types of gear. So to begin with, let's make sure that we're all on the same page here. So I'm hoping that we all already know about standard rack mount gear, so I'll just define the 500 series gear here. So the 500 series rack and 500 series modules were first created by API, and for almost any type of outboard gear, you could theoretically make a 500 version of that gear. So we see 500 series gear versions of preamps, compressors, EQs, and so on. I think it's easiest to just show you guys what 500 series gear looks like, so I'm going to put some images up on the screen for what 500 series modules look like. They're basically smaller vertical versions of what we see in standard rack mount gear. And these 500 series devices are built so that you can mount a bunch of these modules within a rack mountable chassis, and sometimes a freestanding chassis. So I'll put an image of a 500 series chassis on the screen so that you can see what I mean. These chassis tend to hold somewhere between 2 and 10 pieces of gear, depending on which modules you get and which chassis you get. Now, you've probably noticed people calling these 500 series setups a lunchbox, and that's because API, the original creators of this type of setup, named theirs the lunchbox. If you hear someone referring to a chassis made by a different company as a lunchbox, then they're turning it into like a Kleenex or a Frisbee type of situation, in the sense that these were originally brand-specific terms and later grew to be used to reference a generic type of product that's not necessarily specific to the brand. Anyway, the chassis not only houses the modules, but also supplies input and output routing to each module that you place inside it, and it supplies power to those modules. Nicer chassis might have more options on them, like more routing options or stereo linking, or sometimes summing capabilities for the modules that are plugged into it. As the API 500 series gear became commercially successful and more popular, more companies decided to join in on the business. More and more companies started creating smaller versions of their full-size standard gear, smaller versions that were compatible with the API 500 series format. Nowadays, since 500 series gear continues to be successful, we see a wide range of audio gear that resembles, mimics, or matches the API 500 series format. Okay, so now that we all know what we're talking about, let's talk about the differences between the 500 series format and the standard format. So here's what I've found out, but let me know in the comments below if you can add to what I have here. There are a lot of advantages to using a 500 series module, and a lot of the advantages have to do with convenience and flexibility. So they're more compact, so they're easier to transport if you're going to mobile sessions, and if your space is limited, you can theoretically fit more gear into a smaller space, mixing and matching a variety of gear into this more compact and convenient space. I could see this being a big advantage beyond just the space-saving qualities, since if you have more gear within easy reach, that's great for ease of use and possibly even makes your setup more ergonomic. Also, since each 500 series module can easily be popped into and out of your chassis without requiring patching or adjusting your cabling, you can easily and conveniently swap them out on a whim. And probably the biggest difference, the one that people notice first, is how much cheaper the 500 series modules are than standard gear. Sure, you have to buy your chassis, but once you do, each individual 500 series module is much cheaper than the full-size counterpart, bringing down the total cost for the same type of gear. It's much cheaper to buy a chassis with multiple 500 series units than it is to buy the standard versions of those same units. So, all this is great and is really making the 500 series modules sound really appealing, right? So why would anyone choose the full-size gear? Well, this is where the hot debate begins. So a lot of engineers will argue that the comparable 500 series gear sounds just as good as the full-size gear, but others will argue that there are subtle differences that make enough of a difference to them that those engineers will then purchase the full-size gear because of these perceived differences. People get really passionate and serious about this topic. I haven't seen a ton of A/B tests on the subject though, so if you guys know about one, please share it in the comments below. I haven't sat down to do a thorough A/B test myself, so maybe that's a good topic idea for a future video. But until then, I'm not going to personally make a statement about this sound quality argument one way or another. But with that said, I do like to try to use logic to begin to evaluate arguments like this one. So looking at it, there are some inherent differences between the two formats. It makes sense that audio engineers are going to look at the lower price point for 500 series gear and wonder what is sacrificed in order to achieve that price point. What I've learned is that there seems to be one big difference that some audio engineers will argue is behind the difference in quality. So with 500 series units, you have a bunch of units plugged into the same chassis, which means that they're sharing the same power supply. This means that your power supply is sometimes going to be different from your full-size gear power supply. So people that argue in favor of full-size gear will argue that the 500 series gear tends to have a lower voltage power supply than the full-size versions tend to have. And they argue that this, as a general rule, can affect your audio quality. But I mean, it does depend on the specific unit in question. And when you're talking about power supply details, the schematic details of each full-size versus 500 series unit will depend on things like the manufacturer and the model. Taking it another step further and arguing that lowering your power supply voltage will affect the audio quality is another step entirely. It's a step that I personally have not looked into too deeply, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one in the comments below. So yeah, another argument that is made is that the components from 500 series gear might be cheaper components, which can definitely affect the sound quality. I think that it makes logical sense too, since the 500 series is built for a lower price point, but again, components will vary based on the manufacturer and the model. So I don't personally feel comfortable making a blanket statement about it. So tons of people own 500 series gear and they love it. I don't personally own any yet, but I've heard that while they really love their 500 series gear, some people have noticed that it can distort more easily than the original version or work slightly differently than the original version, whereas some people say that their 500 series gear works just as well as the original. And I mean, I think that makes total sense. There's such a range of products out there with different specs and different design, and the 500 series versions do have to be redesigned to fit into a chassis. So it makes total sense that some of this stuff would behave slightly differently. So yeah, that's basically some of the information that I've collected about 500 series gear versus their original counterparts. I don't really have any solid conclusions on sound quality since so much can vary by manufacturer and model, but I do know that a ton of the top studios that I've been in use a combination of standard and 500 series gear, and I haven't noticed people complaining about that. And I mean, I certainly had no complaints about the 500 series gear that I've personally used. So I guess if you're trying to make a super thorough purchasing decision, you could call the manufacturer and ask about differences between the standard and the 500 series versions of whatever gear you're thinking about purchasing, and then you could try to make a decision from there. But I mean, it's definitely a topic that's debated in the audio world, and I know the variables that affect the sound quality will depend on the manufacturer and the specific gear that you're looking into. There doesn't seem to be a secure consensus here, so that leads me to believe that logically the answer might be that, at least in some cases, there's not a significant sacrifice in sound quality with 500 series gear. And I mean, after all, even some of the engineers that argue that there is a difference in sound quality between 500 series and standard gear will also tell you that the difference is not significant enough to avoid purchasing the 500 series. So I think it's maybe more of an argument over principles, and maybe it's not as relevant an argument in a practical sense as some would make you believe. So I would say go for it and get some 500 series gear if you want to. Just make sure that you do your research before making a decision, just like you would for any other gear purchasing decision, right? So that's it for today. I hope that you guys liked this video. So as always, please let me know what you think in the comments below. For today's question, I want to know what you know about the 500 series gear versus regular argument and which type you've purchased in the past. So please leave your answers in the comments below. So thanks guys. As usual, if you like this video, please tell your friends about my channel, watch my other videos, or check out my Patreon. I'll be coming out with new videos every Wednesday, and thanks for watching. Okay. I don't know what else to do with my life. Okay, my camera's about to shit itself, so I'm gonna not do this.